Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are some developments in the eastern section of the front line. The Russians managed to advance to the west of Korokhove, to the southwest of Pokrovsk, and to the east of the city in the direction of Koshchentinivka, along the fortified positions to the south of the city. The Ukrainians in turn are attempting to flank the Russian positions north of Toretsk and in the direction of Torske along the Siversk river line. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to gain control over Bohdanivka, leaving only half of Korokhove remaining under Ukrainian control of the 5 settlements that the Russians were looking to capture to gain control over the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region. Following the capture of the remaining parts of Korokhove, the Russians will be able to start launching offensive operations across the border area to cut off the highway between Novopavlivka and the towns and settlements along the Vovcha river line here to the southeast. The Russians also advanced along the first lines to gain control of an additional one here to the south of Bohdanivka, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the first lines and first patches here south of Bohdanivka to flank the fortified positions along the towns along the Vovcha river line here to the south. The Russians look to attack these fortified positions from their weak spot, which is from the rear, where the Russians will have the geographical advantage and be able to flank the fortified position from the point at which they are not facing. The Russians will look to gain full control over the towns and settlements along the Vovcha river line and the fortified positions aligned with them, gain control over the main highway connecting the Russian forces along their main supply lines towards Novopavlivka, which is a logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces just within the Dnipropetrovsk border area. The Russians gain control over that. They'll be able to launch offensive operations in multiple directions, both to the southwest of the Donetsk region and to the northeast, here west of Pokrovsk, expanding their zone of control and moving northwest towards the next supply hub, which is Meshova. Therefore, we can see that the 3 main logistical hubs for the Ukrainian forces within the Dnipropetrovsk region along the Donetsk border area are the towns of Novopavlivka, Meshova, and Slovyanka. Getting control over all 3 will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations on the western flank of Pokrovsk and bypass a number of fortified layers of the Ukrainians here in the western parts of the region, and also allow them to cut off the connection between any major cities of Ukraine from a western direction with the Pokrovsk direction. Moving further westwards towards the intersection here will cut off the final main road between Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia towards the Donetsk region in its entirety. While the fortified positions that are currently being built within the Dnipropetrovsk region would not be as well fortified as the ones within the Donetsk region itself. Based on this, we can see that the Russians will have an advantage when moving through that area compared to the Donetsk region. Not to mention, there is a less concentration of settlements and urban areas within the Dnipropetrovsk region. The terrain is also more flat. There's not as many forest patches. There's not as many industrial areas. Generally, there will be easier, militarily speaking, for the Russians to advance within the Dnipropetrovsk region compared to the Donetsk region. To the east of Pokrovsk, west of Toretsk, the Russians managed to advance in 3 separate areas. They managed to advance northwest of Alexandropol, where they're looking to advance along the first patches in the area in the direction of Yablonivka. The Russians will look to gain control over the northern outskirts of this pocket area, where heavy fighting is taking place over the remaining settlements and fortified positions. Russians also managed to advance here east of Zelenopole, gaining full control over the road connecting Kalinov in the south with Alexandropol in the north for further offensive operations towards Soria from the western flank. The Russians also managed to gain full control over the fortified positions to the south of Staramykolaivka. With this, the Russians have secured an additional defensive line, moving onwards to the final lines of defense, which are inconsistent and scarce. The Ukrainians really have lost the majority of the fortified positions they had available, and the remaining parts are being threatened from flanks which are exposed. The Russians will look to gain control over Romanivka, Soria, Staramykolaivka, and Hnativka by pushing from the northern flank towards the towns of Romanivka and Soria, gain control over which will completely and physically encircle Hnativka, Staramykolaivka, and the surrounding fortified positions. Gaining control over these remaining towns will allow the Russians to have an open road from Romanivka all the way up towards Yablonivka. The Russians can advance along the main highway towards the first lines here to the west of Katerinivka to flank the town from the western direction and gain control over the reservoir to the south. to then flank the positions of the Ukrainians here near Novosibirsk, Chervenivka, Katerinivka, and along the highway between New York and Kościanivka. Therefore, it is clear that the Russians will look to gain control over these towns, the fortified positions, move towards Oleksandro Kalinove, gain control over the town, move along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians towards the rear of Katerinivka and Klebenbek. This will allow the Russians to cut off the supply lines and to gain control over the rear of Chervenivka and Novosibirsk, allowing them to encircle the Ukrainian forces here in the Toretsk direction. The Russians are working on expanding their zone of control around Toretsk. However, the Ukrainians are constantly launching counterattacks both to the northwest and to the northeast of the city. The Russians are now working on gaining control over the western flank, which will allow them to cut off the supplies. Therefore, it is clear that the Russians will move along to gain control over Novinivka and the towns along the main highway towards the fortified positions. Gaining control over the rear and cutting off the supplies will allow the Russians to encircle the Ukrainian forces and gain control over the western and northern flanks of Toretsk, which will strengthen offensive operations going forward here in the northern direction. Also strengthen the Russian positions along the pocket area, where the Russians will look to gain control over the south of Yablonivka as well. Move along the TO504 highway towards the northern flank of Yablonivka, where fighting will take place over the remaining fortified positions here southwest of Kościanivka. The closer the Russians get to the city of Kościanivka, the more difficult it becomes to advance towards it. However, with the Russian advance here west of Pokrovsk gaining control over the first lines and the remaining parts of Zverove, we see that the Russians are just on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, where the fighting will start to move towards the defensive positions, fortified areas here west of Pokrovsk, now that they've secured the road connecting from Pokrovsk towards Kotlina, weakening the offensive operations from the eastern flank. Russians will look to gain control over the fortified positions, secure a buffer area around Kotlina for offensive operations towards the coal mine and Udashne here to the west. This will allow the Russians to develop further offensive operations in the northwest of Pokrovsk, and also with the control over the residential areas here to the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians can start threatening the Ukrainian supply lines here to the north of Shevchenko, where with the positions close within Pokrovsk, the Russians can start launching FPV drones anywhere within the city itself. They also have several basements within the town of Zverove, which they can occupy, allowing them to survive Ukrainian artillery strikes and drone strikes, allowing them to concentrate larger forces within the town and continue offensive operations along the urban areas, where they will be secure for the most of Ukrainian long-range fire. Instead of that, the Ukrainians will be threatening the supply lines of the Russians in the area to try and attack them while they are on the move between and to the town of Zverove, where the Ukrainians will look to strike them so they can't supply them and inflict as many casualties as possible that way. So we can expect more developments here in the Pokrovsk direction, mainly in the northwestern direction, where the Russians look to gain control over Serhivka, potentially enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region to fight over Novopavlivka, improving the logistical situation of the forces here in the western flank of the city for the operational encirclement of it. To the north of Toretsk, the Ukrainians launch a small counterattack here east of Dashne, cutting off the connection between the first lines from Dashne towards the Drushba. However, the Russians now have control over the main railway towards Dashne, which means that their supply line is secure and they can launch some counterattacks, move towards the fortified positions in the rear, or advance in the direction of Delivka with several supply lines to supply the forces in the northern flank of the city, which means that the Ukrainians are looking to launch some operation where they're really looking to exploit a gap in the Russian defenses and make this a small attack, rather than a larger operation where they look to cut off Russian forces or to re-enter the Toretsk city from the north. This is simply to occupy some of these fortified positions and threaten the Russian forces from the rear. In the direction of Torske along the Serbis river line, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over the farm area and the northernmost outskirts of Torske. The Ukrainians operating from across the river line to launch this operation. We see with this geolocated footage the Ukrainian presence within the northern buildings, where they managed to take some Russian soldiers POW. It seems that the Russians, while moving through the northern parts of the town into the central parts, did not clear all of the basements and all of the areas. The Ukrainian forces already present and some additional reinforcements coming from Sarishne managed to flank the Russian forces operating in the area. However, now the Russians have secured the road to the east, which means that they have additional roads into Torske from the eastern and northeastern directions, which means that the Ukrainian presence here stops the connection between Yapolivka and Torske, weakening the Russian positions in the area, but the Russians are neither operationally or completely encircled, which means that they may look to counterattack from both the northern and southern directions, securing the northern parts again and creating a secure front line along the Serbis river line, and considered offensive operations into Sarishny to the west and Torske to the south. Now, an interesting topic has arisen from people setting questions as to why, when we look at this graph of bodies exchanged between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainians are receiving a lot more body bags than what the Russians are receiving. The easy explanation is that the Russians are advancing. That means that their own bodies are within their own territory that they just captured, while the Ukrainians cannot retrieve their own bodies. Therefore, the Ukrainians receive them from the Russians. However, this does not explain this part here. We can see that during May until August 2023, it is even, and then the Russians receive a lot more body bags from the Ukrainians. This is due to the Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023 and the Battle of Bakhmut, where there were no significant developments in favor of either side until the summer offensive, where the Ukrainians started advancing and the Russians mostly stopped advancing. So we can see that this is true to a certain degree. Despite the Ukrainian summer offensive, where they were gaining territory and the Russians weren't, at most it was a 4-to-1 advantage for the Ukrainians. 44 body bags for 160 body bags from the Ukrainian side compared to the Russian side. Now, if we take a look at the past 3 months from March until May, we can see that it is 900, 900, and 900 body bags on the Ukrainian side compared to 43, 41, and 34 on the Russian side. This is a significant amount of body bags that are being sent back to the Ukrainians. If we take a look at August 2024, we can see that it's about 250 Ukrainian body bags to 38 Russian body bags. In October, it is 89 Russian. This is due to the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Now, since August and all the way to April, the Ukrainian Kursk incursion was ongoing until the Russians fully recaptured the Kursk region. And we can see that the Ukrainian body bags simply increased consistently since until it capped at 909. So what does this mean? This means that despite the fact that during the months of October, November, and December, the Russians actually managed to have more territorial gains compared to January, February, March, and April on average, the body bags of the Ukrainians increased while the territorial gains decreased. What this means is that although the Russian advances have slowed, the amount of bodies that the Ukrainians appear to increase. That means that the Ukrainians during these months, during their counterattacks that they started during the month of January, have seen more and more losses in their manpower. And the ratio between the Russian and Ukrainian forces is extremely significantly in favor of the Russians. During March is 43 to 909, or almost, or just above 20 to 1 in favor of the Russians, while in the month of May it is 34 to 909, almost 30 times in favor of the Russians, and this is compared to a 4-to-1 advantage for the Ukrainians during the months of August. And we can see the number of body bags all the way to April 2024 is significantly lower than we currently see. During April 2024, it was 176 bodies exchanged between the Russians and the Ukrainians, while over the past 3 months it's almost been 1,000 every month. That is almost 6 times more than that time. If the casualties in this period also means that it has increased by 6 times, that means that the casualties taken by both sides has significantly increased during this period of time. In conclusion, the past 12 months have been a meat grinder, and we're seeing the culmination of it during this time where the Russians are about to launch their summer offensive. If my analysis is correct, then the Ukrainians have suffered heavy losses over the past 12 months. The balance of power has increased significantly in favor of the Russians, and with this summer offensive, then the Ukrainian lines may break. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.